The mud sucked at her boots with every step, each footfall requiring more strength than she possessed. And Josephine Vale knew that if she stopped moving now, she would never start again. The rain had turned the Arizona desert into a treacherous landscape of slick clay and hidden stones, transforming what should have been a 2-hour walk into an endless march through hell. Her dress clung to her legs, heavy with water and mud, and her carefully pinned hair had long since fallen into sodden tangles against her neck. She had left the stagecoach wreckage 5 miles back, the only survivor of a wheel that had cracked on a rain-slick rock, sending the whole contraption tumbling down an embankment. The driver had broken his neck in the fall. The other passenger, an elderly merchant, had lived just long enough to tell her to head east toward Globe, Arizona, before his eyes glazed over and his breathing stopped. That had been hours ago, or perhaps days. Time had lost all meaning in the monotonous gray landscape, where rain fell in sheets and the sky pressed down like wet wool. Josephine had 23 years of life behind her, and she was beginning to think those years would be all she would ever have. Her feet burned inside her ruined boots, blisters upon blisters making each step agony. The canvas bag containing all her worldly possessions had been lost somewhere in the first mile, sacrificed to the mud when she could no longer bear its weight. She crested a low rise and nearly wept with relief. Below her, perhaps a quarter-mile distant, she could see buildings. Not Globe, she knew that much. The merchant had said Globe was still 10 miles from where the stage had crashed. This must be one of the ranches that dotted the territory, providing beef to the mining towns that had sprung up like weeds after silver was discovered in the Globe Hills back in 1876. It was 1883 now, and the territory was civilized enough to have regular stage service, though clearly not civilized enough to maintain decent roads. Josephine started down the slope, her legs trembling with exhaustion. She had made it perhaps 50 yards when her knee buckled and she went down hard, landing on her hands in the thick mud. For a long moment, she simply knelt there, rain streaming down her face, mixing with the tears she could no longer hold back. She had come to Arizona territory to start over, to escape the stifling expectations of her family in Philadelphia, to make something of herself as a schoolteacher in a town that desperately needed one. Instead, she was going to die in the mud, alone and forgotten. The sound of hoofbeats cut through her despair. Josephine lifted her head to see a rider approaching, moving carefully through the treacherous footing. Even through the rain, she could make out his silhouette, broad-shouldered and tall in the saddle, wearing a wide-brimmed hat that channeled water away from his face. He reached her in moments, swinging down from his horse with practiced ease. "Madam." His voice was deep, concerned with the slight drawl of someone who had spent his life under western skies. "Madam, are you hurt?" Josephine tried to speak, but all that came out was a sob. She was hurt everywhere and nowhere, bruised and exhausted and so very, very tired. The man knelt beside her in the mud without hesitation, and she finally got a good look at his face. He was perhaps 26 or 27, with strong features weathered by sun and wind, a jaw dark with several days' worth of stubble, and eyes the color of summer grass that studied her with genuine concern. "Can you stand?" he asked gently. "My ranch is just down the hill. Let me get you somewhere dry." "I tried," Josephine managed to whisper. "The stage, it crashed. The others, they are dead." His expression tightened. "Where?" "West, 5 miles, maybe more. I have been walking since dawn." She had no idea if that was true, but it felt like dawn had been a lifetime ago. The cowboy looked back toward the west, then at her, clearly calculating. "We need to get you warm and dry first. Then I will ride out and see to the dead. Can you hold on to me if I lift you onto my horse?" Josephine nodded, though she was not sure it was true. But the man made it easy, lifting her as though she weighed nothing and settling her into his saddle before swinging up behind her. His arm came around her waist, steadying her, and she sagged back against his solid warmth, too exhausted to maintain any pretense of propriety. "I am Ethan Norwood," he said as he urged his horse into a careful walk down the hill. "This is my ranch, the 3 Bars. You are safe now." "Josephine Vale," she replied, her voice barely audible over the rain. "I was supposed to teach school in Globe. You still will, Miss Vale, soon as this storm passes and you have recovered." He said it with such certainty that she almost believed him. The ranch house materialized out of the rain, a sturdy adobe structure with a covered porch and real glass windows. Ethan guided his horse right up to the porch steps before dismounting and reaching up for Josephine. Her legs buckled the moment her feet touched the ground, and he caught her easily, lifting her into his arms. "I am getting mud everywhere," she protested weakly. "Mud washes." He carried her through the front door into a main room that was blessedly warm and dry. A fire burned in a stone fireplace, and the room was furnished simply but comfortably, with handmade furniture and Navajo rugs on the plank floor. "Let me get you settled, then I will fetch some water and blankets." He set her down carefully in a chair near the fire, and Josephine finally got a good look at herself. She was covered head to toe in mud, her dress ruined beyond any hope of salvaging, her boots caked so thickly she could barely see the leather beneath. Her hands were scraped and bloody from her falls, and her feet throbbed with a pain that was becoming impossible to ignore. Ethan returned with an armful of blankets and a basin of water. He set them down beside her chair, then knelt and began unlacing her boots with gentle, efficient movements. Josephine wanted to protest, to maintain some shred of dignity, but she lacked the strength. She simply sat there, trembling, as he carefully removed first one boot and then the other, revealing feet that were swollen and blistered, caked with mud and spotted with blood where the blisters had burst. His jaw tightened when he saw the state of her feet, but he said nothing. Instead, he reached for his belt and unhooked his canteen, pouring the clean water over her feet to wash away the worst of the mud. The water was cool and soothing, and Josephine could not stop the small sound of relief that escaped her lips. "You walked miles in this," Ethan said quietly, not quite a question, "in this mud with your feet torn up like this." "I had no choice," Josephine replied. "The stage was destroyed. I could stay with the dead or I could walk." He poured more water from his canteen, carefully washing between her toes, his touch surprisingly gentle for a man with such large, work-roughened hands. "You are one of the bravest women I have ever met, Miss Vale." Josephine laughed, though it came out more like a sob. "I am one of the most foolish. I left Philadelphia for this. Adventure, I thought, a new life in the territories. You will have that new life." Ethan looked up at her, his green eyes steady and sure. "Just maybe not quite the way you imagined it starting." He finished washing her feet and dried them carefully with a clean towel, then examined the blisters with a practiced eye. "These need proper tending. I have some salve that will help with the pain and prevent infection. But first, you need to get out of those wet clothes and into something dry and warm, or you will catch pneumonia." Josephine felt heat rise to her cheeks despite her exhaustion. "I have nothing. My bag was lost in the mud. I will find you something of mine. It will not fit proper, but it will be dry." He stood and disappeared into another room, returning moments later with a flannel shirt and a pair of trousers. "The bedroom is through that door. Take your time. I will put some coffee on and see about getting you something hot to eat." Josephine accepted the clothes with trembling hands and made her way to the bedroom, closing the door behind her. The room was as simply furnished as the rest of the house, dominated by a large bed covered with a colorful quilt. She peeled off her muddy dress with difficulty, her fingers clumsy with cold and exhaustion, then stripped away her ruined undergarments until she stood naked and shivering. For a moment, she caught sight of herself in a small mirror on the wall and barely recognized the woman staring back. Pale and gaunt, with dark circles under her eyes and mud still streaked through her hair. The flannel shirt was soft and warm against her skin, smelling faintly of soap and sage and something indefinably masculine. She rolled up the sleeves and buttoned it to her throat, then pulled on the trousers, which were comically large but stayed up when she cinched the belt tight. There was a brush on the dresser, and she used it to work the worst of the tangles from her hair, though she lacked the energy to do more than pull it back and secure it with a leather cord she found in a drawer. When she emerged from the bedroom, she found Ethan standing by the fireplace, having clearly changed his own clothes while she was occupied. He had washed the mud from his face and hands and now wore a clean shirt and dry trousers, though his feet were still bare. He turned when he heard her and smiled, a slow, warm expression that transformed his serious face into something almost beautiful. "Better?" he asked. "Much, thank you." Josephine moved back to the chair by the fire, sinking into it gratefully. The coffee pot was bubbling over the flames, filling the room with a rich, comforting aroma. Ethan poured 2 cups and handed one to her, then settled into the chair opposite. "I need to ride out and see to the stage," he said, "but I do not want to leave you alone, not in your condition. My foreman, Miguel, should be back with the other hands soon. They have been out checking the herd, making sure the cattle did not scatter in the storm. Once they return, I will go." "The driver was named Thomas Hendricks," Josephine said softly. "The other passenger was Samuel Morton. They deserve to be buried properly." "They will be." Ethan took a sip of his coffee, studying her over the rim of his cup. What made a Philadelphia lady decide to teach school in Globe, Arizona? Josephine wrapped her hands around the warm cup, grateful for something to focus on besides the throbbing pain in her feet. "My father is a banker. My mother is a banker's wife. They had my life planned out from the moment I was born. Marry a banker's son, become a banker's wife, have banker grandchildren to carry on the family tradition. When I told them I wanted to teach, they were horrified. When I told them I wanted to teach in the territories, they nearly disowned me. But they did not. No. My father said I could go, on the condition that if I failed I would come home and accept the life they had chosen for me. He seemed quite certain I would be back within 6 months. She smiled bitterly. Perhaps he was right. "You have not failed," Ethan said firmly. "A stage accident is not failure. It is bad luck. You will get to Globe and you will teach those children and you will make a life out here. I am certain of it. You barely know me. How can you be certain?" "Because you walked 5 miles through mud with your feet torn to pieces rather than give up. That is not the kind of person who fails at anything." He set down his coffee cup and leaned forward, his expression earnest. "The territories are hard, Miss Vale. They break weak people. But they also give strong people room to become who they are meant to be. You are strong. I can see it." Before Josephine could respond, the sound of horses and men's voices drifted in from outside. Ethan rose and opened the door, calling out to someone named Miguel. A few minutes later, a weathered man in his 40s entered the house, rain dripping from his hat brim. He glanced at Josephine with open curiosity but was too polite to ask questions. "Miguel, this is Miss Vale. Her stage crashed about 5 miles west of here. The driver and 1 passenger are dead. I need you to stay with Miss Vale while I ride out to see to the bodies and salvage what can be salvaged." Miguel nodded immediately. Of course, patron. The lady will be safe here. Ethan turned back to Josephine. Try to rest. Miguel will look after you. When I return, I will properly tend those feet and we will work out how to get you to Globe. Josephine wanted to protest, to tell him she had imposed enough already, but the truth was she could barely keep her eyes open. The warmth of the fire, the coffee, and the simple relief of being safe and dry were conspiring to drag her under. She managed a nod, and Ethan smiled again before pulling on his rain slicker and heading back out into the storm. Miguel proved to be a man of few words but great kindness. He heated up a pot of beans and cornbread left over from the midday meal and insisted Josephine eat, watching with satisfaction as she discovered she was ravenous. He spoke a little of the ranch, how Ethan had built it up from nothing over the past 5 years, running cattle on land he had homesteaded fair and square. The hands respected him, Miguel said, because he worked harder than any of them and never asked them to do anything he would not do himself. He is a good man, Miguel concluded, as though this settled everything that needed to be said about Ethan Norwood. Josephine found she could not argue. Everything about her rescue, from the way Ethan had knelt in the mud beside her to the gentle care he had taken washing her feet, spoke of a man with a deep well of decency. It was so different from the Philadelphia men she had known, with their polished manners and hollow words. Ethan was direct, honest, and utterly without pretense. She must have dozed off in the chair because the next thing she knew, Ethan was shaking her shoulder gently, and the light coming through the windows had taken on the golden quality of late afternoon. The rain had stopped, she realized, and the world outside had that fresh, washed clarity that comes after a storm. I am sorry to wake you, Ethan said, but I need to treat those feet before infection sets in. Josephine blinked away the fog of sleep and saw that he had brought the basin, fresh water, and a small wooden box that presumably contained medical supplies. He knelt in front of her chair just as he had before, and she was struck again by the simple humility of the gesture. How many men of her acquaintance would kneel before a woman for any reason other than a marriage proposal? Ethan worked with quiet concentration, cleaning each blister carefully and applying a salve that stung at first but quickly numbed the pain. He bandaged her feet with clean strips of cloth, wrapping them securely but not so tight as to cut off circulation. His hands were steady and sure, and Josephine found herself watching his face as he worked, noting the small scar above his left eyebrow, the laugh lines at the corners of his eyes, the way his jaw tightened in concentration. "You have done this before," she observed. "You do not run a ranch without learning basic doctoring, for animals and men both." He tied off the last bandage and sat back on his heels, meeting her eyes. "I found the stage. It was as you said. Thomas Hendricks and Samuel Morton are both dead. I buried them where they fell and marked the graves. When the weather clears properly, I will ride into Globe and notify the authorities." "Thank you," Josephine said softly, "for everything. I do not know how I can ever repay your kindness." "There is no debt, Miss Vale. This is what neighbors do out here. We help each other because there is no one else to do it." He paused, then added, "I did find your bag. It was half buried in the mud about a mile from the stage. Most of what was in it is ruined, but I brought it back. Perhaps there is something salvageable." He retrieved a muddy canvas bag from near the door, and Josephine opened it with trembling hands. Her spare dress was ruined, as were most of her undergarments. But wrapped in oilcloth at the bottom of the bag were the things that mattered most: her teaching certificate, a daguerreotype of her younger sister, and a small leather-bound journal in which she had been recording her journey. She clutched these treasures to her chest, tears pricking her eyes. "Thank goodness," she whispered. "I thought I had lost everything." "You did not lose yourself," Ethan said quietly. "That is what matters most." Over the next 3 days, as Josephine's feet healed and the roads dried enough to be passable again, she found herself settling into the rhythm of ranch life. Ethan insisted she stay in his room while he bunked with the hands in the bunkhouse, a gesture of propriety that would have made her Philadelphia mother proud. Miguel's wife, Rosa, came up from their small house near the barn to help Josephine with the things a woman needed, bringing her a dress that had belonged to Rosa's daughter before she married and moved to Tucson. The dress was simple cotton, worn but clean, and fit Josephine reasonably well with a few quick alterations. Rosa also brought a pair of soft moccasins for Josephine's still tender feet and taught her how to make tortillas on the cast iron griddle in Ethan's kitchen. The two women did not share much language in common, Rosa's English being as limited as Josephine's Spanish, but they communicated well enough through gestures and smiles. Ethan was out working the ranch from dawn to dusk, but he took his meals at the house, and Josephine found herself looking forward to these times with an anticipation that surprised her. He would come in dusty and tired, washing up at the basin on the porch before joining her at the simple wooden table. They talked about everything and nothing, her life in Philadelphia, his childhood on a hardscrabble farm in Kansas, the challenges of ranching in Arizona territory, the books they had read, and the places they dreamed of seeing. "Why Globe?" Ethan asked one evening as they lingered over coffee after supper. "Of all the towns out here that need teachers, why did you choose Globe?" The pay was good, and the school board seemed genuinely committed to education. "But honestly," Josephine smiled ruefully, "I liked the name. I thought it sounded worldly and cosmopolitan. I did not realize it was named after a globe-shaped silver nugget someone found in 1876. Ethan laughed, a rich, warm sound that seemed to fill the room. The territories are full of stories like that. Towns named for the strangest reasons by people with more optimism than sense. But Globe is a good town, growing fast with the mines. They need a teacher like you." "What about you?" Josephine asked. "Why ranching? Why here?" "I came west after the war," Ethan said, his expression growing distant. "Well, not that war. I was too young for the rebellion. But I served in the cavalry during the troubles with the Apache. Saw things I would rather forget. When my enlistment was up, I knew I could not go back to Kansas and farm corn like my father. I needed space, room to breathe. So I filed a homestead claim on this land and started building. It must have been hard starting from nothing. It was, still is some days, but it is mine, Miss Vale. Every acre, every head of cattle, every board in this house. I built it with my own hands and sweat. There is satisfaction in that I never found in anything else." Josephine understood that sentiment more than he might have guessed. It was why she had come west, after all. Not just to escape her family's expectations, but to build something of her own, to prove to herself that she was more than just a decorative piece in someone else's grand design. On the 4th day, Ethan declared her feet healed enough for the journey to Globe. He hitched up his wagon early that morning, padding the back with blankets to make it as comfortable as possible, and they set out under a sky so blue it hurt to look at. The road was still muddy in places, but passable, and Ethan drove carefully, avoiding the worst ruts and pools. Josephine sat beside him on the bench seat, very aware of his presence, of the way his shoulder occasionally brushed against hers as the wagon swayed. She had spent 4 days in his home, eating food he provided, sleeping in his bed, wearing clothes he had given her, and somehow in that time he had become more than just her rescuer. She found herself noticing small things about him, The way he always made sure she had the best portion of whatever meal they shared, how he listened when she talked as though every word mattered, the quiet competence with which he handled every task. "Will you come back?" she asked suddenly, surprising herself with the question. "To Globe, I mean. Will I see you again?" Ethan was quiet for a long moment, his eyes on the road ahead. "I bring cattle into Globe every few months to sell to the mining companies, and I need supplies regular enough. So yes, you will see me again, Miss Vale, if you want to, that is." "I want to," Josephine said softly, and felt heat rise to her cheeks at her own boldness. He turned to look at her then, and the expression in his green eyes made her breath catch. "Good," he said simply. "Because I am not ready to say goodbye to you just yet, Josephine Vale." It was the first time he had used her given name, and the sound of it in his deep voice sent a shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with cold. They rode in comfortable silence after that, but there was a new awareness between them, a tension that was not unpleasant but rather full of promise. Globe appeared in the distance as they crested a hill, a sprawling collection of buildings nestled in a valley surrounded by low mountains. Even from a distance, Josephine could hear the sounds of industry, the stamp mills processing ore, the shouts of men, the general din of a mining town in full operation. It was nothing like Philadelphia, with its orderly streets and civilized quiet. This was raw and rough and utterly alive. Ethan drove straight to the schoolhouse, a modest building on the edge of town with a bell tower and a small teacherage attached to the side. A man was sweeping the front steps, and he looked up in surprise as the wagon pulled to a stop. "Can I help you?" he called out. "I am looking for the school board," Ethan replied. "I have your new teacher here." The man dropped his broom and hurried over, his face lighting up. "Miss Vale, we heard about the stage accident. The driver from the next run reported finding the wreck. We feared the worst." "I survived, thanks to Mr. Norwood," Josephine said as Ethan helped her down from the wagon. "He found me and cared for me until I was well enough to travel." The man, who introduced himself as William Frost, the head of the school board, pumped Ethan's hand enthusiastically. "We owe you a great debt, Mr. Norwood. Miss Vale comes highly recommended. We have been without a teacher for 6 months now, and the children are running wild." "I did what anyone would do," Ethan said, but he looked pleased nonetheless. William showed them the teacherage, a small but clean 2-room space with a bedroom, a sitting area, and a tiny kitchen. Someone had already stocked it with basic supplies, and there was even a vase of wildflowers on the table. Josephine felt a lump rise in her throat at the thoughtfulness of it. "School starts Monday," William was saying. "That gives you a few days to settle in and prepare. We have 23 students, ages 6 to 14. Most of them can read and cipher a bit, but they need proper instruction. The school board will pay you $40 a month, plus you have free use of the teacherage and a small budget for books and supplies." $40 a month was a fortune compared to what she might have earned teaching in Philadelphia, where women teachers were paid a fraction of what men received. Josephine felt a surge of excitement at the thought of finally beginning the work she had come so far to do. After William left, promising to return later with more information about her students, Josephine turned to find Ethan standing awkwardly in the doorway, his hat in his hands. "Well," he said, "I suppose this is where I leave you to your new life." "I suppose so," Josephine replied, but she did not want him to go. The thought of him riding away back to his ranch, leaving her alone in this strange town, filled her with unexpected dread. "Thank you, Ethan, for everything. You saved my life." "You saved your own life," he corrected gently. "You just needed a little help at the end." He turned to go, but Josephine reached out and caught his arm. "You said you come to Globe regularly. Will you call on me? I mean, if it would not be too much trouble. Ethan's face broke into that slow, warm smile she had come to cherish. It would be no trouble at all. In fact, I cannot think of anything I would like more. He took her hand, the one that rested on his arm, and raised it to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles that was both perfectly proper and utterly thrilling. Then he was gone, striding back to his wagon and climbing aboard. Josephine stood in the doorway of her new home and watched him drive away, one hand pressed to her chest where her heart was beating far too fast. The next few days passed in a blur of activity. Members of the school board came by to introduce themselves and offer assistance. The local minister's wife, a kind woman named Sarah, took Josephine under her wing and introduced her around town. Josephine learned quickly that Globe was a town of contrasts. Rough miners rubbing shoulders with respectable merchants, saloons on one street and churches on the next, opportunity and danger existing side by side. She spent her evenings preparing lessons and getting the schoolhouse in order. The previous teacher had left it in reasonable shape, with slates and chalk, a few worn primers, and a large map of the United States on one wall. Josephine added her own touches: wildflowers in a jar on her desk, the alphabet written in her best hand on the chalkboard, a sign on the door that read, "Welcome, students." Monday morning came too quickly and not quickly enough. Josephine woke before dawn, too nervous to sleep, and dressed carefully in her borrowed dress. She braided her hair and pinned it up in a severe style that she hoped made her look older and more authoritative, then walked the short distance to the schoolhouse. The students began arriving just after 8, brought by parents or older siblings, or wandering in on their own. They ranged from tiny 6-year-olds to gangly adolescents, and they regarded their new teacher with expressions ranging from curiosity to suspicion. Josephine smiled at each one, learning names and making mental notes about personalities and needs. By the time she rang the bell to start class, she had 21 of her 23 students present. She stood at the front of the room, feeling the weight of 24 eyes on her, and took a deep breath. "Good morning," she said, projecting her voice the way she had been taught. "My name is Miss Vale, and I am very pleased to be your teacher. I know some of you have been without regular instruction for some time, but that is going to change. We are going to learn together, work hard together, and create something special together. Who can tell me what you most want to learn this year?" A small forest of hands shot up, and Josephine felt her nervousness melt away. These children wanted to learn. They were hungry for it, and she was going to give them everything she had. The weeks that followed established a pattern that was both exhausting and deeply satisfying. Josephine taught reading, writing, arithmetic, history, and geography to students at wildly different skill levels, often juggling multiple lessons at once. She stayed up late by lamplight preparing materials and grading work, and woke early to tidy the schoolhouse before students arrived. It was harder than anything she had ever done in Philadelphia, and she loved every minute of it. True to his word, Ethan came to town regularly. At first, it was every 2 weeks, ostensibly to sell cattle or buy supplies. But Josephine noticed that his visits always included a stop at the schoolhouse, often with some small gift. A book he thought she might enjoy, fresh vegetables from Rosa's garden, once even a new slate when he noticed one of her students making do with a cracked one. They would walk together through town, talking easily about her students and his ranch, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, their relationship deepened into something more than friendship. Ethan never pressed her, never presumed, but his intentions were clear in the way he looked at her, in the gentle care he took with everything concerning her well-being. One Saturday in October, nearly 2 months after her arrival in Globe, Ethan asked if she would like to see the ranch again. "Rosa has been asking after you," he said. "And I thought you might enjoy a day away from town. I promised to have you back before dark." Josephine accepted eagerly, and they made the journey in Ethan's wagon, enjoying the crisp fall air and the changing colors of the desert vegetation. The ranch looked different than she remembered, more vibrant somehow, and she realized it was because she was seeing it through different eyes. This was not just the place where she had recovered from her ordeal, but the home of a man she had come to care for deeply. Rosa greeted her with delight, insisting she come see the new additions to the vegetable garden and taste the preserves she had been putting up for winter. Miguel tipped his hat and told her the ranch had been too quiet without her, which made Josephine laugh. The hands, most of whom she was meeting for the first time, regarded her with friendly curiosity, clearly wondering about her relationship with their boss. After a lunch of Rosa's excellent cooking, Ethan asked if Josephine would like to ride out and see some of the ranch. She agreed, though she admitted she had limited experience with horses. "I will give you Daisy," Ethan said, leading her to the corral where a gentle-looking mare stood dozing in the sun. "She is the calmest horse I own. She will take good care of you." He was right. Daisy was patient with Josephine's inexpert mounting and sitting, and soon they were riding out across the range at an easy walk. Ethan pointed out various features of his land: the creek that provided year-round water, the pastures where he rotated his cattle, the line of cottonwoods that marked the northern boundary of his property. They stopped at the top of a rise that offered a view for miles in every direction. The afternoon sun painted the landscape in shades of gold and amber, and the air was so clear Josephine felt she could see forever. "This is beautiful," she said softly. "I never imagined the desert could be beautiful, but it is." "It grows on you," Ethan agreed. He dismounted and helped her down from Daisy, then stood looking out over his land with an expression of quiet pride. "Some days I still cannot believe this is mine, that I built something lasting here." "You should be proud," Josephine said. "You have created something wonderful." He turned to look at her, and something in his expression made her breath catch. "I have been thinking," he said slowly, "about other things I would like to build. A larger house, maybe, big enough for a family, children running around, a woman's touch in the decoration." Josephine's heart began to pound. "That sounds lovely." "Josephine." He took her hands in his green eyes intense and earnest. "I know it has only been a few months since we met. I know you came out here to be a teacher, to prove yourself, to build your own life. But I find myself hoping that maybe, if you felt the same way, we could build that life together." "Are you asking what I think you are asking?" Josephine whispered. "I am asking if you would consider marrying me," Ethan said. "I know I am just a rancher. I cannot offer you the kind of life you left behind in Philadelphia. But I can promise to work hard, to provide for you, to respect your dreams and support your teaching. And I can promise to love you with everything I have, every day, for as long as I live." Tears spilled down Josephine's cheeks, but she was smiling. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Ethan, I will marry you." He pulled her into his arms then, holding her close, and when he kissed her it was gentle and sweet and full of promise. Josephine wrapped her arms around his neck and kissed him back, feeling as though her heart might burst from the sheer joy of it. They were married 6 weeks later, in the small church in Globe with half the town in attendance. Sarah, the minister's wife, helped Josephine make a dress from white cotton, and Rosa wove wildflowers into a crown for her hair. Ethan wore his best suit, his hair freshly cut and his boots polished to a shine. And when Josephine walked down the aisle on William Frost's arm, she saw such love in Ethan's eyes that she knew she had made the right choice. The question of her teaching had been settled early. Josephine would continue at the schoolhouse until the end of the term, then take the summer off before deciding whether to return in the fall. It was not traditional for a married woman to work, but Globe was not a traditional town, and the school board was desperate enough to keep her that they readily agreed to the arrangement. After a simple reception at the church, Ethan drove his bride home to the ranch. Home. The word settled into Josephine's heart as they crossed onto 3 Bars land. This was her home now, not just a place she was staying or visiting, but truly hers. Ethan had been busy in the weeks leading up to the wedding. The main room of the house had been cleaned and polished until it gleamed, and he had built several pieces of new furniture, including a proper wardrobe for Josephine's things and a bookshelf for the books they both loved. The bedroom had been freshened with new curtains and a beautiful quilt that Rosa had made as a wedding gift. That first night as husband and wife was tender and sweet, a discovery of each other that was both nervous and natural. Ethan was patient and gentle, and Josephine felt safe in his arms in a way she had never experienced before. They fell asleep tangled together, listening to the sounds of the ranch settling for the night. The months that followed were an adjustment for both of them. Josephine continued teaching during the week, staying at the teacherage in town and riding out to the ranch on weekends. It was not an ideal arrangement, but it worked well enough. Ethan often came to town on Wednesday evenings, taking supper with her at the teacherage and helping her prepare lessons. The students quickly grew accustomed to Mr. Norwood's presence, and he proved to have a knack for explaining mathematical concepts that Josephine sometimes struggled with. When the school term ended in May, Josephine moved to the ranch full-time, and her life took on a new rhythm. She learned to manage a household on the frontier, to cook over a wood stove, to tend a garden, to preserve food for the winter. Rosa was an invaluable teacher, patient with Josephine's mistakes and generous with her knowledge. But Josephine also brought her own skills to the ranch. She organized Ethan's chaotic record-keeping, establishing a proper system for tracking expenses and income. She taught Miguel's youngest children to read, holding informal lessons at the kitchen table. And she began advocating for better education throughout the area, writing letters to the territorial government and organizing fundraisers for school supplies. Ethan supported all of it, proud of his wife's intelligence and drive. He never once suggested she should content herself with domestic duties, never made her feel less than because she wanted more than just to be a rancher's wife. Instead, he encouraged her ambitions, helped her however he could, and loved her with a steadiness that was both comforting and thrilling. Their first year of marriage was not without challenges. There was a drought that summer that killed off some of their best grazing land and forced Ethan to sell cattle at a loss. Josephine came down with a fever in August that had them both terrified until it finally broke after 3 days. And there was an awkward visit from Josephine's mother in September, during which Mrs. Vale made her disapproval of her daughter's choices abundantly clear, before returning to Philadelphia with a huff. But there were far more joys than sorrows. Long evenings spent on the porch watching the sunset. Lazy Sunday mornings in bed, talking and laughing and making love. Working side by side on ranch projects. Josephine learning to ride well enough to help move cattle. Ethan learning to appreciate poetry when she read aloud to him in the evenings. And in March of 1885, nearly 2 years after Josephine had stumbled half dead through the mud to find salvation at Ethan's hands, she discovered she was pregnant. The news filled them both with a mixture of joy and terror. They were miles from any proper doctor, though Globe did have a midwife with a good reputation. Josephine's pregnancy progressed normally through the spring and summer, and Rosa assured her that childbirth, was a natural thing that women had been managing since the beginning of time. Still, Ethan worried. He fussed over her constantly, insisting she rest more, forbidding her from any heavy labor. Josephine tolerated his concern with good humor, knowing it came from love, though she drew the line at being treated like an invalid. In late October, when the desert had cooled from the blazing heat of summer, Josephine went into labor. It was hard and painful and seemed to last forever, but Rosa and the midwife from Globe were there, guiding her through it. And when she finally heard her baby's first cry, all the pain was forgotten in a rush of overwhelming love. "A son," Rosa announced, placing the squalling infant on Josephine's chest. "A strong, healthy boy." Ethan, who had been banished to the main room during the worst of the labor, was allowed back in. He approached the bed cautiously, his face pale, his eyes wide with wonder. When he looked down at his son, tears spilled freely down his weathered cheeks. "He is perfect," he whispered. "You are both perfect." They named him James Vale Norwood, honoring Josephine's maiden name and starting a tradition they would continue with all their children. James was a good baby, healthy and strong, and he brought a new dimension of joy to the ranch. Ethan proved to be a doting father, utterly smitten with his son, often carrying the baby with him as he went about his work. Josephine did not return to teaching that year, choosing instead to focus on James and the ranch. But she did not abandon education entirely. She started a small library in Globe, soliciting book donations from Eastern acquaintances, and organizing it in a room behind the church. She also began writing articles about frontier education for Eastern newspapers, building a small reputation as an expert on the subject. 2 years later, their daughter Sarah was born, named for the minister's wife who had become Josephine's closest friend. Sarah was as fierce and determined as her mother, with her father's green eyes and a will of iron. She kept them all on their toes from the moment she learned to crawl. The ranch prospered as Arizona territory grew and changed around them. The Apache troubles ended, more settlers arrived, and towns like Globe transformed from rough mining camps into proper communities with schools and churches and social organizations. Ethan expanded his herd and his land holdings, becoming one of the more successful ranchers in the region. But he never lost the essential humility and decency that had made him kneel in the mud to wash a stranger's feet all those years ago. He was known throughout the area as a fair man, an honest dealer, someone who could be counted on in a crisis. And when people asked about his success, he always credited his wife, saying that marrying Josephine Vale was the smartest thing he had ever done. Josephine felt the same about him. Sometimes, usually late at night when she was lying in his arms listening to his steady heartbeat, she would think back to that terrible day when she had stumbled through the mud, certain she was going to die. If the stage had not crashed, if she had not survived, if she had gone left instead of right, she would never have found Ethan. Never would have known this life, this love, these children. In 1889, their third child was born, another boy they named Thomas after the stage driver whose death had, in a strange way, brought Josephine and Ethan together. And in 1891, when Josephine was 31 and thought they were done having children, she discovered she was pregnant again. Their youngest, a daughter named Rose, was born in early 1892, completing their family. The children grew up on the ranch, learning to ride and rope and work cattle, but also to read and write and think critically about the world. Josephine tutored them at home, ensuring they had educations equal to any they might have received in the East. She also continued her advocacy work, and by the mid-1890s, she had helped establish 3 new schools in rural areas around Globe. In 1896, when James was 11 and Rose was 4, Josephine received a letter from her father. Her mother had passed away the previous winter, and he was writing to inform her of this and to ask if she might ever return to Philadelphia for a visit. The letter was stiff and formal, but Josephine could read between the lines. Her father was old and lonely and, perhaps, regretful of the distance that had grown between them. She discussed it with Ethan, and they decided to make the journey east as a family. It was a grand adventure for the children, who had never been on a train before, and a strange homecoming for Josephine, who had not seen Philadelphia in 13 years. The city seemed small to her now, cramped and dirty, lacking the vast skies and clean air of Arizona. Her childhood home, which had once seemed so grand, felt stuffy and pretentious. But seeing her father again was good. He was older, grayer, more stooped than she remembered, but his eyes lit up when he saw his grandchildren. Over the course of their 2-week visit, Josephine and her father talked more honestly than they ever had before. He admitted he had been wrong to try to force her into a life she did not want. She forgave him for not understanding what she needed. And when they left to return to Arizona, it was with a promise to write regularly and to visit again. On the train home, as the eastern cities gave way to plains and then to desert, Josephine felt a profound sense of gratitude. She had been given the chance to build exactly the life she wanted, with a man who supported and cherished her, in a place that challenged and inspired her. How many people could say that? The years continued to pass, marked by the usual joys and sorrows of life. The children grew, thrived, occasionally drove their parents to distraction with adolescent rebellion, but ultimately became good, decent people. James grew into a rancher like his father, taking over more and more of the 3 bars operations as Ethan slowed down. Sarah shocked everyone by deciding to become a doctor, heading east to medical school with her parents' full support and returning to set up practice in Globe. Thomas became a teacher, carrying on his mother's legacy, and Rose married a mining engineer and moved to Bisbee. Through it all, Ethan and Josephine remained devoted to each other. They had the occasional argument, as all couples do, but they never went to bed angry and never let the sun set on harsh words. They took walks together every evening when the weather permitted, holding hands like young courtiers. They still made love regularly, their passion tempered but not diminished by time. In 1910, Arizona was preparing for statehood, and the territory was swept up in excitement about the future. Josephine and Ethan, now in their 50s, found themselves attending meetings and celebrations, honored as pioneers who had helped build the new state. At one such event, a young newspaper reporter interviewed them about their experiences. She was particularly interested in how they had met, and Josephine found herself telling the story of the stage crash, the desperate walk through the mud, and the cowboy rancher who had knelt to wash her feet. "That was when I knew," Josephine said, glancing at Ethan with a smile. "That was when I knew he was different from any man I had ever met. He saw someone in need and he helped, without expectation of reward or recognition. He just knelt down in the mud and washed my feet with his own canteen water, as though it was the most natural thing in the world." "It was the most natural thing," Ethan protested, embarrassed by the attention. "You needed help and I was there to give it." "But not everyone would have," Josephine insisted. "Not everyone would have taken in a stranger, nursed her back to health, made sure she got where she was going. You did all that and asked for nothing in return." "I got everything in return," Ethan said quietly, taking her hand. "I got you." The reporter wrote a lovely piece about them that was picked up by several Eastern newspapers, and for a while they were minor celebrities. But the attention faded, as it always does, and they went back to their normal lives. Arizona achieved statehood in 1912, and Josephine and Ethan attended the ceremony in Phoenix, proud to have witnessed the transformation from territory to state. By then, they had 7 grandchildren, with more on the way, and the 3 Bars Ranch was being run primarily by James and his wife, though Ethan still rode out most days to check on things. Josephine had slowed down too, though she remained active in educational causes and served on the board of several charitable organizations. She had published a book about frontier education that was used as a textbook in several normal schools, and she corresponded regularly with educators throughout the West. In the summer of 1918, as the world was tearing itself apart in a great war, Ethan fell ill. It started as a cough that would not go away, progressing to a fever and weakness that frightened everyone. Sarah came from Globe to care for her father, and for a few terrible weeks, Josephine thought she might lose him. But Ethan was tough, carved from the same stubborn material as the land he had homesteaded. He pulled through, though he emerged from the illness frailer than before, finally looking his 59 years. "You gave me a scare," Josephine told him one afternoon as they sat together on the porch, watching the sun set over the land they both loved. "I am not going anywhere yet," Ethan assured her, squeezing her hand. "I figure we have at least another 20 years together. I want to see all our grandchildren grown. I want to watch Arizona thrive, and I want to spend every possible moment with you." 20 years sounds good, Josephine agreed, leaning her head on his shoulder. "Though I will take whatever we are given and be grateful for it." They got their 20 years, and then some. As they moved through their 60s and into their 70s, they slowed down but never stopped. Ethan finally turned the ranch over to James completely in 1925, but he still rode out regularly, offering advice when asked and generally making sure his legacy was in good hands. Josephine continued her work for education, even as her own schoolchildren became teachers themselves, and then had children of their own who went to school. She lived to see education become universal in Arizona, to see one-room schoolhouses replaced by proper schools with multiple teachers and rich curricula. On their 50th wedding anniversary in 1933, their children and grandchildren, and even a few great-grandchildren gathered at the ranch for a celebration. There was food and music and laughter, and at one point, James raised a glass in a toast. "To my parents," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "who taught us by example what it means to love someone, to build a life together, to face hardship with courage and joy with gratitude. You have given us all an example to live up to, and we are grateful every day for that gift." Everyone raised their glasses, and Josephine found herself crying, overwhelmed by the love in that room, by the knowledge that she and Ethan had created all of this. Not just the children and grandchildren, though that was miracle enough, but the values and traditions and love that would carry on long after they were gone. That night, as they prepared for bed in the room where they had spent so many nights together, Ethan pulled Josephine into his arms and held her close. "You have any regrets?" he asked softly. "Looking back on our life together, is there anything you would change?" Josephine thought about it seriously, running through the catalog of their years together. The struggles and the triumphs, the sorrows and the joys, the hard times and the good times. And she realized that even the difficult parts had been valuable, had shaped them and strengthened them and made them who they were. "No," she said finally, "I would not change a single thing, even the stage crash that brought us together, even that terrible walk through the mud. Because it led me to you, and you have been the greatest gift of my life." "The feeling is entirely mutual," Ethan said, kissing her forehead. You saved me, Josephine. I did not even know I needed saving until you stumbled onto my land, half dead and covered in mud. But you woke something up in me, made me see that life could be more than just work and survival. You taught me how to really live." They held each other in the darkness, two people who had found each other against all odds and built something beautiful together. Outside, the Arizona night was clear and still, stars scattered across the sky like diamonds on velvet. The ranch slept peacefully around them, the land they had tended and loved for 5 decades. Ethan passed away peacefully in his sleep in the spring of 1936, at the age of 77. He had been working in the garden the day before, helping Josephine plant tomatoes, and he had gone to bed that night apparently healthy and content. When she woke the next morning, he was simply gone, his face peaceful, his hand still resting in hers where she had placed it during the night. The funeral was held at the ranch, with what seemed like half of Arizona in attendance. Ranchers and miners, teachers and students, old friends and new, all came to pay their respects to a man who had lived his life with quiet dignity and unwavering integrity. Josephine stood by his grave, surrounded by her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and felt both profound sorrow and deep gratitude. She had been blessed with 50 years of his love, and that was more than many people got in a lifetime. She lived on at the ranch for 3 more years, though she was increasingly frail. Sarah moved in with her, caring for her mother with the same gentle competence Ethan had shown that day he washed Josephine's feet in the mud. Josephine spent her days reading, writing letters to her extensive network of friends and family, and sitting on the porch watching the land she had come to love as much as Ethan had. She talked often to his memory, telling him about the small events of her days, asking his opinion on family matters, reminiscing about their years together. And sometimes, late at night, she swore she could feel his presence beside her, warm and solid and real, as though death was no barrier to the love they had shared. Josephine Vale Norwood died quietly in her sleep on a cool October morning in 1939, at the age of 79. Her last thoughts were of Ethan, and of that moment when she had looked up through the rain and mud to see a cowboy rancher kneeling beside her, offering help without expectation, seeing her as a person worthy of care and dignity even at her lowest point. She was buried beside Ethan on the hill overlooking the ranch, their graves marked with simple headstones that bore their names and the dates of their lives. But their real legacy was not in stone or earth. It was in the children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who carried their values forward. It was in the schools Josephine had helped establish and the students she had taught. It was in the ranch that still bore the 3 Bars brand, and in the land that had been loved and tended and passed down through generations. And it was in the story that was told and retold at family gatherings, of how a Philadelphia lady had walked miles through mud after a stage crash, and how a cowboy rancher had knelt and washed her feet with his own canteen water, and how that simple act of kindness had blossomed into a love that lasted a lifetime and beyond. It was a story that reminded everyone who heard it that love, real love, is found in the small moments of tenderness and care, in the choice to see another's humanity and respond with grace, in the willingness to kneel in the mud and offer what you have, even when it is only a little water from your canteen. The 3 Bars Ranch still stands today, now run by Josephine and Ethan's great-great-grandchildren, a testament to the life they built together. And on the hill where they are buried, wildflowers bloom every spring, scattered by the wind and watered by the occasional desert rain, a natural memorial to 2 people who found each other against all odds and loved each other through all the challenges life could throw at them. Their story became part of Arizona history, a reminder that the true spirit of the West was not found in gunfights and gold strikes, but in the everyday heroism of ordinary people who chose compassion over indifference, community over isolation, and love over fear. It was a story that began with a desperate woman walking through mud and a kind man with a canteen, and it ended only when death itself could not separate two hearts that had become, over 50 years of marriage, one single beating thing.